I am Mackenzie901K, and in today's video we are going to be doing a beginner's guide to fantasy. I seen Sarah do a similar video to this and I kind of wanted to put my own 2 cents into it and talk about some of my book recommendations for beginners who are just now maybe thinking about getting into the fantasy genre. So let's talk about fantasy for a second. If you guys are brand new to fantasy, you're probably thinking, you know, what is a fantasy book? What makes fantasy? Fantasy is pretty much, in my opinion, a book that is just otherworldly, or it has elements that are not found in day-to-day life. Like, it could take place in a completely different world. It could be about witches. It could be about other types of supernatural beings like ghosts, vampires. It could also be about people with supernatural abilities like superpowers. Something like that. That is pretty much what I feel as though fantasy is. There are so many different kinds of fantasy books nowadays, and the genre can definitely seem overwhelming, but all of the fantasy books that I've kind of gathered today are pretty easy to get into. They're not too complex, and a lot of these are also YA. So what do I think makes a fantasy book easier to understand, more difficult to understand? One of those is the world building. There are some fantasy books where the first whole book is just world building and you get minimal plot. There are some fantasy books that they're very complicated to understand. They have very complex worlds, very complex magic systems. There are fantasy books like Lord of the Rings. To me, is a great definition of a book that has a lot of complexity to it and depth into that I feel as though, because I've personally tried to read the Lord of the Rings series, I feel as though those books are harder to get into. They're still fun, but just for beginners, I recommend something YA. Not a lot of books in the series. Something that doesn't have a lot of world building. Maybe something even more character focused that maybe also has a little bit of romance in it. So with that being said, let's get right on into the recommendations and why I think these would be great books for someone starting out. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is reading book series. Fantasy books are known to have multiple books that make up a series. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5, sometimes there's 20 books that make up a fantasy book series. I feel as though if you're just starting out into fantasy, you want to stay within probably 2 to 3 books, maybe even 1. So I do have a couple standalones here to talk about. They're both by Margaret Rogerson. This one is about a girl who paints fae. She's tasked with painting one of the prince's portrait, but she paints a human emotion in his eyes, and faes in this world cannot show human emotion, so that could honestly get him into some pretty serious trouble. She is captured to be taken and imprisoned, but other things kind of happen, and this book really to me is a lot of vibes and the plot is very minimal. So if you're looking for something that has a little bit of romance in it, it's a very good standalone book if you're wanting to start with standalones. Same thing here with this Margaret Rogerson book. This is Sorcery of Thorns. This book has, to me, a little bit more plot than Enchantment of Ravens. This book is about a girl named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth lives in a magical library that the books come to life, and one night while Elizabeth is sleeping, she hears this big ruckus I almost said Big Bang, but Big Ruckus. And she goes to investigate, and she finds that one of the books has come to life and has killed the library's headmaster. So she then looks guilty for this murder because she's found there with a weapon and all of that. So she's actually taken to be imprisoned, and she meets up with this guy named Nathaniel Thorne, who tries to help prove her innocence. This book also has some really good romance in it. Honestly, I kind of prefer this book over this book, but like I said, if you're just starting out, this book is only about 300 pages and this one is 456, so it is a little bit shorter. I adored this book, and it does have a sequel, kind of, but not really. The sequel does follow more of Elizabeth and Nathaniel post what happens in this book, and it has more romance in it than what this one does. So if you're wanting something with a little bit more romance, you can read this and then read the little sequel. It's only about 100 pages. These are great standalones to start out with. So next, we're going to kind of go in the order of, I guess, book series. Next, I'm going to talk about some duologies. I'm going to talk about the duology that got me into reading, which was the Daughter of a Pirate King duology by Tricia Levenseller. This book is fantasy romance. The romance is more prevalent, I think, than in Sorcery of Thorns and Enchantment of Ravens. These books are not long. I love this book series. This book series is very fast paced. The world building to me is not complex at all. And when you get in it, you get right into the action. You don't get a lot of background at first. You kind of learn as you go. And that's one thing that I do really admire about this book. The fact that it is fast paced and it keeps your attention. I feel like sometimes with fantasy books, you can kind of get lost in the nitty gritty of world building, character building, things like that. But sometimes I just want a good fantasy book with a lot of action that will tell me the story as we read it. This, like I said, is the book series that got me back into reading. This was the first book series that I read as soon as I graduated high school back in 2021. I'm in love. I read this book series every single year. It is one of my favorite book series of all time. This does have a second book in the series, and that is Daughter of a Siren Queen. And then in November, I want to say, they're coming out with a book about two other characters that you meet in this series that's kind of like a spin-off to Daughter of a Pirate King, which is going to be really interesting. This is about a pirate named Alosa, and Alosa is tasked with finding this map for her father. So she gets herself captured on purpose to find this map on this rebel pirate ship, but she's also kind of catching feelings for the first mate, which is really interesting. Alosa, she is unapologetic for everything that she does, but she's also like a lady and she likes to wear nice clothes and things like that. So overall, I love this book series. If you don't pick any of the book series in this video except for one, it should be this one. You will not be disappointed. Going along with the duology vibe, we have these Hollow Vows. This is another duology that has fae in it, so this one is a little bit different. So the fae in this world are pretty cruel, or at least people think that they're pretty cruel. But this follows a girl named Bree. Bree and her sister kind of just live this Cinderella-esque life. They kind of really don't have a lot. One day, Bree's sister gets sold to the silly court, and Bree decides that she's going to go save her sister. She has to deal with the cruel fae. This book, I think, is a great book to start with if you're wanting to get into fae, because from what I can remember, it's not super duper political heavy, which I know is a common theme in fae books, is that they can have a lot of politics. and I think that it doesn't. There's a love triangle in here. The romance is not as heavy in this first book, but is better in the second book, and overall I really like it. It kept me interested. I also really think that if you want to try to give fantasy a try, maybe listening to fantasy might be something you're interested in. Daughter of a Pirate King has an amazing narrator, and I also love the narrator for this book series. It's a great introduction into the Fae world overall. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about trilogies. I wanted to talk about The Cruel Prince after mentioning that book. The Cruel Prince, oh, I forgot to mention that all of the books that I've mentioned so far, except for, no, Sorcerer of Thorns is YA too, I think. All of these books are YA, so they're young adult fantasy, and I find young adult fantasy to be a lot easier to understand than adult fantasy, because I feel like the world building is not as complex. The Cruel Prince also is YA, and this book series is so good. I loved it. I also read this book series before I read the popular Acatar series, which we're going to talk about very soon. The Cruel Prince is not as romance heavy as these Hollow Vows is. It is a lot more world building and a lot more politics, so that may not be something that you're interested in right away, but I promise what little bit of romance we get is very worth it. I love Carden so much. I think he is amazing. This world is very beautiful. I think Holly Black's writing is gorgeous, and I think also kind of what drew me in is the inside art, because I just think that made it even more whimsical. It feels whimsical reading this series, and Holly Black's writing, you can just, like, to me, get right in and love it. And it got me into Fae. This was actually the first Fae book series that I read when I got back into reading. I didn't find it hard to understand at all. I listened to it, though I didn't physically read it. I listened to all of the books. The Cruel Prince trilogy, it's a trilogy. There's 3 books, but there's also a couple spin-off books. One that's full of Carden stories, and then one that's about Jude's little brother Oak. It does get bigger, but just the Cruel Prince series is a 3-book series. Quickly, the Cruel Prince is about Jude, who lives in a Fae world because she was taken from the human world when she was a child, and pretty much they treat her awful because she's human, she's different, and the Fae just, they do not like that, and she has to follow all these weird protocols and things because she's human. And it's just really about Jude growing in this Fae world and becoming her own person, and I think it's such a beautiful story. Next, I'm going to talk about another favorite of mine that I don't really talk about a lot on this channel, but that I feel deserves all the hype in the world, and that is Renegades. Renegades, this is actually probably one of the biggest books I'm going to recommend to you. It's over 500 pages. It's 552 pages. But it's worth it. I love this book series. So this is about a girl named Nova. Nova's in the Anarchists. So Anarchists are pretty much the villains of this world, and then there are the Renegades. And the Renegades are like the heroes, like the police. So Nova wants to invade the Renegades because of something that happened a long time ago. She wants to avenge the Anarchists and pretty much put the Renegades out of power. This first book is a little bit slower, I'm not gonna lie, but the second 2 books in the series are so good. It does have a lot of world building in it though, and the romance is also not as heavy in this book, but the romance is so good, and the sprinkles that you get throughout the series is so good. But the plot of this book is amazing. The story building, the world building that Marissa Mayer does. This is a 6-star series for me. I love this book series, and I will always recommend it. It may not be the first book that you want to pick up as a beginner. I would maybe try to do some of the other books that I mentioned first and then pick up Renegades, just because it is a little bit thicker. It's good. The next book that I'm going to mention is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This book is not talked about a lot anymore on here, and I feel as though it's a really good book series if you're wanting to get into fantasy One, there's a show. Two, I feel like the world building is not that hard to understand. The Grisha can be a little bit confusing, and the Grisha are just like the people with magic in this world. They can be a little bit confusing to like understand like which Grisha goes where, but the more you read the book, the more you'll understand it. So this book is about Elena Starkov, and she has magic that she never knew that she had. One day she enters the Fold, which is like this big black fog full of just bad things. She is crossing it to go into the western side of the world. She discovers in the Fold that she has this light magic, and pretty much this magic can defeat the Fold. So she's taken in by the Grisha to train and learn how to defeat the Fold. It's a great beginner series as one of your first few series that you're wanting to get into. It's a 3-book series, but the world expands. There is the Six of Crows duology after the Shadow and Bone trilogy that you can read. Personally, the Six of Crows duology is my favorite over Shadow and Bone, and I have not got into the second duology that comes after this, but these are the two that I recommend that you start with. I do recommend that you read Shadow and Bone before Six of Crows though. It's in chronological order. These take place before these do. You could get a little bit confused. I personally read them in order, so I can't really hold to that, but you do kind of understand the world and like why the world is the way it is in this book series following this book series. The last trilogy that I kind of want to talk about is Caraval by Stephanie Garber. This is a book about a magical carnival that appears, and you have to get invited to it, and Scarlett has been writing to the headmaster for a very long time, and she's getting ready to get married, and she decides to write to the carnival headmaster one more time, and she gets invited, but her sister Tella goes missing, and she pretty much has to play the Caraval game in order to find her sister, and the world just kind of builds from there. I do recommend that people who are getting into fantasy read this series because it's one of the OG series, and honestly it is still good. It just wasn't my personal favorite, but this also has a trilogy following it called Once Upon a Broken Heart series, also by Stephanie Garber, and this follows a fate that is mentioned in this book named Jax, and it follows Evangeline, and it is very fairy tale whimsical in a very different vibe than Caraval, so I recommend those two trilogies. Stephanie Garber did come out and say that you don't have to read Caraval first. I read Caraval first, and I enjoyed it that way because I feel like it won't be hard to understand the world. You just get to know the characters more, and then you see certain characters pop up in the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. I always just love like seeing characters that I already know in another book series and being like, oh my god, hi, that kind of thing. So if you want to read the Caraval series first, you can. You don't have to, but am I still gonna recommend it? Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about some longer series that I have, and then we'll talk about some books that are the series are still coming out. First, I'm gonna mention Acatar. Acatar is one of the most popular fantasy series to date, especially on Book Talk. Acatar is about a girl named Feyre, and Feyre is this just normal girl. She takes care of her family, she hunts for her family, she does everything for them, and one day she's out hunting and she kills a wolf, and that wolf turns out to be a fae, and she's taken away to live in this fae world, and she is pretty much told that either she goes and she lives there for the rest of her life or she dies, and that is how Acatar starts off. This first book is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but that retelling doesn't really carry out as the rest of the series goes. It kind of becomes its own thing. It's a really good series. There's 5 books out in it right now. It is a continuous series, but I don't think that this should be a beginner's first read into fantasy, because as the series goes along, it becomes less about the romance and more about politics, which can get a little bit confusing. So So that's why I'm saying you should try something else that I mentioned earlier first. But this is still a really good beginner's book. If you've read a little bit of fantasy and you kind of understand what fantasy is about and you're wanting to pick up something a little bit more challenging, do Acatar. And then we have Shatter Me by Tahira Mafi. This is a dystopian fantasy series, so it's a little bit different. It takes place in our world just years in the future, and this book follows Juliet, and Juliet has a deadly touch. We pretty much start with her being in an asylum for this deadly touch. It just kind of goes from there. That's really all you need to know about this book. There is a love triangle in it. It's very, very, very good. It's a 6-book series with little novellas in between, and it is a bigger series. Now this book series you could start out with. If you're new to fantasy, this could be something that you want to start out with because it is easy to understand and these books are really easy to fly through. So while I did recommend in the beginning to start off with a shorter book series, this series is an exception because while it is 6 books, it is still very easy to get through and very easy to understand, and it's overall an enjoyable series. We're going to rapid fire these last few books because I'm sick of my camera dying and I don't want to refilm this video. That was Shatter Me. It's just a longer series, but the books, you fly through them. They're great. So I have 2 books, and these books are continuous series, so they're not done yet. Let's talk about this one first. This book has been everywhere. I've talked about this book a couple times now on my channel. I love this book so much. This is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This book is about a girl named Violet. Violet's whole life, she's pretty much been trained to be a scribe. Well, plans change. Her mother wants her to go into the writer's quadrant and be a writer, and Violet also, she has this disability where her bones break easier, things like that. So it's kind of quite dangerous for her to be going into this writer's quadrant in the first place, but that just kind of makes it even more dangerous. But Violet's a baddie, like she ain't gonna let much stop her. And then there's also a love story in here, and Rebecca Yarros herself said that this book was for the people who love romance but want to read fantasy, and it's a fantasy book for romance readers. And I definitely think that the world building is not complicated at all. It's so good. It's just this book series is not completed, and I think that there's supposed to be 5 books, but right now is the perfect time to jump into Fourth Wing because the 2nd book comes out in November on the 7th, which is awesome. So I highly recommend that you read it. It's got dragons in it, and if dragons doesn't scream fantasy, I don't know what does. It's so good. The very last book of the video is a book that I need to talk about more, and that is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This book is my favorite book of the year, hands down. I read this book in January and I still think about this book all the time. It's finally getting the hype it deserves on YouTube, and I'm seeing so many people read it, which is making me so happy. So this book is about a girl named Peyton, and this world, there are elites and ordinaries, and elites are trying to kill off all the ordinaries so that way that they can just have an elite society. But Peyton is an ordinary, and she has been training her whole life to be a psychic and to pretty much pretend that she has these elites powers so that way nobody kills her, and she's very good at it. I will say, if I met her on the street, I wouldn't have been able to tell a difference because she's really good at being a psychic and she's really good at reading people. So she saves one of the princes one day, and then she is invited to compete in these trials, and not really invited, she kind of has to go compete in these trials, and these trials are for elites, and they are very deadly to her. And there's a lot of romance in here. The world building in this book is not complicated. This book is not very complicated. It is beautifully written. I love Lauren's writing, and this is actually her debut novel. There's going to be 3 books in the series. series. It's going to be a trilogy, and the next one comes out sometime next year. I'm obsessed. This book also releases in the US in November, but you can buy it overseas on Blackwell's. You can buy it from the UK right now. So I highly recommend that you pick this up either ASAP or in November. It's so good. It is a very good beginner book. She compares it to The Hunger Games and Red Queen that put them together, but they look nothing like their parents. So that is every book that I think that a beginner should read. Let me know if you guys have some more suggestions for beginners down below. To all my beginners in fantasy, I hope you guys love this genre, and if you guys have any questions for me, I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. I'm not nowhere near a fantasy know-all. I've only been reading the fantasy genre for a couple of years now, but I will try to answer your question to the best of my ability. And guys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Turn on my post notification bell. I do have some exciting announcements coming soon that you guys should stick around for. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you.